Continuing with that, like whatever you said, for the poverty, for the migrant levels, what is the role of multilateral institutions that like supporting poor and vulnerable, supporting small businesses, economic recovery? How we can channelize the maximizing the benefits accruing to the people?
So I think so. It's a very broad question. There's no simple way to respond to that.
Yes.
But a policy response, like to the extent that policy response and advisory affect outcomes for the vulnerable, I think there's role for good policy research to understand the drivers of the vulnerability. For example, in the case of migrants, as I was earlier commenting, the issue is the loss of livelihood, which seems temporary,
Yes.
but has a longer term estimate
Yes.
projection. And the reason for that is till the new normal is attained, the migrant labor do not have sources of livelihood to go back to. And no one
Yeah.
knows in
Indeed.
what is the time frame of the return of the migrants. They want to return, society wants them to return. It's good for production, it's good for productivity. Um, and we do not know a policy response that could quickly fix that problem. So I think understanding and unpacking the problem is really important. It's important to unpack the problem so that we can first identify the vulnerable and target them through livelihood support measures, which remains the primary concern during the pandemic. We need to ensure welfare. We need to ensure that the benefits reach the poor. Despite any leakages in the system and administrative inefficiencies and coordination problems and high transaction costs,
Yes.
despite all those problems, the agenda is to get the support to the vulnerable and the poor, which includes the migrant groups.
Yes. Yes. Indeed. Indeed. How do you think COVID has affected the ease of doing business in various countries? If we talk about especially India as well and the other
Right.
countries.
So I think your question is about the business environment, right?
Yeah,
Business
business.
environment challenges. Yeah.
Yes. That index that World Bank publishes. So there
Right.
are different criteria. Yeah.
So I wouldn't characterize the pandemic as bringing new challenges, although I'm sure there are a few new challenges, brand new complexities that have been exposed, that companies have been exposed to, businesses. But I think doing business in the old way has become more difficult because of the pandemic.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Perfect.
Let me use a few examples to motivate this view. Let us look at credit information. So one of the important aspects of running a business is access to credit.
Yes.
Access to credit from financial institution works based on an architecture of credit information. So businesses' creditworthiness is known partially or completely to financial institutions, and that information is shared to some measure between financial institutions as a signal of
Yeah.
creditworthiness of businesses. So let us think about the problem of the pandemic. The pandemic has meant that revenues have depleted, margins have been lost, and liquidity is the fatal blow. With lack of liquidity, what is most likely to happen is that small business, particularly, but even it applies to larger businesses, are less likely to be able to pay dues to their creditors, which means it perversely affects their credit history, credit worthiness, and different signals. So imagine that this happens in the first few months of the pandemic as the first order effects on their businesses are realized. The second order effect that it causes is that during a period of resilience and recovery, when the same businesses need to access more credit to rebuild their businesses,
Yes.
that same credit information, which has now been, in some cases, reduced in its quality, is going to preclude them from accessing credit on good terms from a large number of creditors. So you see the
Yes.
problem. The old problem of access to credit has now been magnified because of the pandemic. It's not a new problem,
Yeah.
but it is affecting businesses in a new manner. So
Yes. Yeah.
that's an example. I can think of a few other examples related to know your client requirements, licensing,
Awesome.
customs clearance, and logistics. There's so many examples. Let me use the example of logistics and customs clearance. So we know that supply chains have been disrupted,
Yes.
which then translates into backlogs at logistics hubs, ports, shipment centers.
Yes.
And the backlog is a problem because so we know that in India and developing countries, some strides are being made to improve clearance times. Time has always been an issue.
Yes. Yes.
And businesses do not like to wait for these clearances. What has happened because of the pandemic is that because of delays experienced at transportation and logistics hubs, the delays have been increased. That delays have increased. When delays increase, which means that emergency and much needed supplies that have, if they have come in, are now less accessible to businesses. So again, an old problem of delay is further magnified because of the pandemic. So I think these are some examples in which doing business has become particularly challenging in this time. There are several policy solutions to it. One of them would be regulatory reform of a magnitude and order not seen before.
Yes.
So I'll leave it
Yeah.
at that. Right.
Yeah. Rightly said, because turnaround time in India is already high if we talk about the ports, especially.
Correct.
So that's good.